start the clock.
Good afternoon. At the tone, time will be
Real time.
Questions number 6, 7, 8, and 9 are derived from short passages. There's two types of short passages. In this section, you will find paragraphs of about 100 words long, and after the paragraph, you get two questions. We'll see later in the test there's a slightly different type of one, the dual passage. Let's look at the first passage. We'll talk more about the reading when we get to the longer passages, but in the short paragraph passages, all you're trying to do is briefly summarize what the passage states. Stop the recording for just a minute, read the passage, and try to come up with the main idea. The main idea should be expressed in a very brief, perhaps one-sentence manner. This is what I got out of the passage. From these 104 words, I interpreted this to mean the following. Scientists used to study ocean currents from floating junk and etc., but now they use CTD, which is much better. Of course, you may have worded it differently, but that's the main idea. It's a very short, simple concept. It's not anything like the longer passages. It's a single thought. To me, it reminds me of cartoons with little thought bubbles, and that's really not a bad way of thinking about these types of questions. So let's look at these questions and see what sort of problems they pose. Number 6 wants you to interpret the first sentence. The first sentence, of course, is Number 6 wants you to interpret the first sentence. The first sentence, of course, is For centuries, oceanographers have snatched clues to ocean currents where they could. Number 6 and number 7 were easy questions. They're levels 1 and 2 respectively. What do we know about this passage? That these are scientists and they're trying to snatch clues. They're setting up an analogy. Scientists snatching clues is most analogous to which of the following? Is it lawyers presenting a case? Don't think so. Is it explorers climbing a mountain? I don't think so, because they mention the fact that these would be unscaled mountains. The oceans have been studied before, so that's not a good analogy. Besides ruling out A, lawyers, and B, explorers, you can easily rule out doctors performing surgery. That's choice D. There was nothing similar to a delicate surgery mentioned in this passage. On all reading passages, even the short ones that we have here, you are never trying to find the correct answer. You are always trying to eliminate at least 3 incorrect answers. You have 2 possibilities left. C, investigators trying to solve a mystery, and E, researchers applying a new methodology. The SAT people are very clever. They've given you 2 choices. Both are true, but which one is relevant? They like doing this. A lot of students confuse something being true with being correct. Remember, the first sentence talked about oceanographers snatching clues. That's much more relevant to investigators trying to solve a mystery. Snatching clues and mysteries are very, very, very interrelated. Researchers applying new methodology, which is done in the passage, doesn't respond to that first sentence. As we said before, number 7 is relatively easy. It's a level 2. It asks you to interpret lines 8 and 10, which were, these days a host of ingenious instruments delivers intriguing news of the origins and routes of water. To best answer this, of course, you have to go back to the main idea that we spoke of, that scientists used to study the ocean from junk and etc., but now they use new equipment. Remember, the first few sentences spoke of how scientists used to do things. The passage then tells you about early ideas. Only then do they come up with the sentence they refer to in the question, these days. I think it's best to eliminate the wrong answers, not to look for the correct answer. There's no authority cited. As we said before, number 7 is relatively easy. It's a level 2. It asks you to interpret lines 8 and 10, which were, these days a host of ingenious instruments delivers intriguing news of the origins and routes of water. To best answer this, of course, you have to go back to the main idea that we spoke of, that scientists used to study the ocean from junk and etc., but now they use new equipment. Remember, the first few sentences spoke of how scientists used to do things. That's why this question is really not very difficult. They've given you the situation where they tell you how scientists used to get information, and then they switch to this statement, these days a host of ingenious instruments does so and so. This is not authority. This is not an option. This is not a position or a qualification. This is a transition. We used to do it this way, now we do it this way. They're making a simple transition, therefore the answer is C. Easy as number 6 and 7 were, number 8 and 9 are much more difficult. Matter of fact, number 8 is a level 5 and number 9 is a level 3. Take a minute reading this passage again. It's about the same size as the last one. Should only take you a minute or so. And try to come up with what you think is the main idea. This is how I interpreted the main idea of this short passage. Most musicians need technical training. As easy as number 6 and 7 were, number 8 and 9 are much more difficult. Matter of fact, number 8 is a level 5 and number 9 is a level 3. Take a minute reading this passage again. It's about the same size as the last one. Should only take you a minute or so. And try to come up with what you think is the main idea. This is how I interpreted the main idea of this short passage. Most musicians need technical training. However, jazz musicians must learn more. They need to learn both technique and how to find their soul. There's 3 things in this main idea that may not appear at first to be important, but they're very important. First of all, look at the use of however. It's used in the passage. Anytime you have contrast in any type of reading, you probably have an important idea coming up. When Mary tells John, I love you, but, the important stuff is not before the but, it's after the but. Contrast in any reading are important. Second, it's the concept of enumeration. In this case, it was just 2 items. They simply had to use the word both. The word both represents 2 items, and it's a simple form of counting out things, enumeration. Sometimes it's item 1, item 2, and item 3. In this case, they just used the word both. The third item was the use of metaphor or simile. Toward the end of the passage, you'll find wording which states that the jazz musician must find his or her soul. That's sort of a metaphor, isn't it? As you can see, this was a much more complicated passage than the first one we read. even though it's about the same number of words. When we deal with the longer passages, you'll also find that you'll be looking for contrast words, you'll be looking for enumeration, and you certainly will be looking for metaphors. So this is a good practice. We'll now turn our attention to question number 8. Remember that this is a level 5. The question is asking what generalization about jazz training is most directly supported by the passage. It doesn't really say that it's directly supported, but the best example of that. In this particular case, I think you really have to remember first the main idea, which was that most musicians need technical training. However, jazz musicians need to learn more, both technique and how to find their soul. And second, I think it would be important to look toward the end of the passage where it states, and I'll quote this, quote, "For after the jazz musician has learned the fundamentals of an instrument and the standard techniques of jazz, such as intonations and traditional styles, the musician must then find his or her soul." Unquote. Those are very similar concepts. What I interpret from this is that being a jazz artist and being a jazz musician is difficult. You not only have to learn what all the other musicians learn, you have to dive into this perilous object called your soul and pull something out of it. I don't know about you, but diving into my soul and learning a lot of technique sounds pretty difficult. A lot of work. Choice A, therefore, seems a little attractive because it uses the word difficult, but it's saying the value of jazz training is difficult to access, not the actual act of it. So, although A is attractive, it is not what we want as a correct answer. It's certainly a wrong answer. B likewise has faults. Its focus on formal technique is excessive. All they tell us is that all musicians have to learn technique, so that's not really what we wanted. D, it should precede conservatory training, is irrelevant. And E, it has been the source of much controversy. I don't really see the controversy here. It just says that jazz requires you to dig into your soul and learn a lot. Remember that this is a level 5. The question is asking what generalization about jazz training is most directly supported by the passage. It doesn't really say that it's directly supported, but the best example of that. In this particular case, I think you really have to remember first the main idea, which was that most musicians need technical training. However, jazz musicians need to learn more, both technique and how to find their soul. And second, I think it would be important to look toward the end of the passage where it states, and I'll quote this, quote, "For after the jazz musician has learned the fundamentals of an instrument and the standard techniques of jazz, such as intonations and traditional styles, the musician must then find his or her soul." Unquote. Those are very similar concepts. Although number 9 is indeed simpler than number 8, it still requires you to make some sort of inference. You're not going to find the information directly. That's frustrating because when you read the question, it seems as though you could go to lines 13 to 18 and get the answer. Let's look at the specific quotation they refer to. Quote, "All this through achieving that subtle identification between the instrument and the musician's deepest drives, which will allow for expression of each artist's distinctive voice." If you're normal, reading something like this should be downright painful. It really seems like a nightmare generated by some English major's disturbed mind. To me, first and foremost, Communication should be used to communicate, and the person writing this was just trying to be impressive with their use of language, and in the process of doing that, I think they've lost most readers. It's rather hard to follow. To me, it's just gobbledygook. I hope you feel the same way, but if you don't, good for you. I think the only thing you really need to know in order to answer this question is an element of the main idea, which was that jazz musicians must learn how to find their soul. That's a little fuzzy and a little metaphorical, but it gets the main point that you need to understand in order to answer this question. Choice 8 tells you that jazz is hard to define. Well, if you're having to search around your soul, I suppose that's true, but that's not the only thing A says. It says it's hard to find and varies among performers. I don't really know if that's the point of this, that it's hard to define. Choice B tells you that it takes years of training for jazz musicians' skills. Well, that may be true, but that's true of all musicians, apparently. They have to learn a lot of technique. Choice C is listening to jazz has therapeutic value. I don't know where they got that. It's some psychobabble, I suppose. It really isn't the point. For the most part, any choices that deal with psychological answers are answers that sound as though your psychiatrist might have written them is usually wrong. Psychobabble is incorrect on the SAT. Choice D makes jazz analogous to paintings and sculptures. Don't think so. Again, it's irrelevant. The correct answer, of course, is choice E, which says jazz is highly personal and creative. And when you're talking about fiddling with your soul and diving in and figuring your soul out, that's probably what they're getting to, and E is the correct answer.